Get behind me, Satan. These are some pretty strong words that Jesus tells Peter. How are we to understand what he means by this? Well, one way to understand is to go back to the very beginning of the Bible, back in Genesis 3, where we see the serpent talking to Eve. Now, church tradition has, I think in my mind, rightly identified the serpent with Satan. And so by looking at how the serpent, Satan, talks to Eve, we can see how this great opponent of God tempts us, tempts humans. Now, if you recall in that famous scene, the serpent approaches Eve, and in the words of the King James Bible, he says, "Yea, hath God said." Did God really tell you, Eve, that you can't eat from any of these trees here? And she says, no, just this one. And, oh, why is that? And because if we do, we will die. And the great adversary of God says, no, you won't die, Eve. He tempts her by saying, you instead will be like God. You will know like God. And it is in that statement that we see how Satan, how the great opponent of God, operates in the world by tempting us. He tempts us in ways to make us want to be, take the role of, take the place of God. And so with that story in mind, we can now understand better what Jesus means when he tells Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Peter is one of Jesus's 12 disciples, and disciple literally means a learner. And so Jesus is the rabbi, he's the teacher. And so we could think of this picture of the disciples with Jesus sort of above them and all the disciples kind of at his feet, at their appropriate place, learning. But then Jesus gives this very hard teaching about what will happen to him and how he will have to suffer. And Peter goes up and takes Jesus aside and says, no, that should not be how it is. In other words, Peter leaves his place as a disciple at the feet of Jesus where he can learn and presumes to be equal to Jesus, equal to God, telling Jesus what actually should happen. And Jesus sees what Peter is doing and he recognizes this is not really Peter so much acting as it is Satan, the great adversary, and how Satan tempts us to be equal to take the role of, to take over for God. And one of the most, I think, difficult or tempting ways that we feel that we should take over for God is when we get angry for God. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, at the very, very beginning of the letter, in the first chapter, he sort of gives a definition of the wrath of God, the anger of God. And he says that the wrath of God is revealed against all ungodliness and wickedness. Some translations have unrighteousness, and the word literally means injustice, adikia, no justice. And so what Paul is saying is that when God sees injustice in the world, God gets very angry. The wrath of God is revealed against all of this injustice. But where we can go off the rails, I think, is when we listen to the voice of the tempter and we decide to get angry on behalf of God, to take this wrath upon ourselves. So much of what is happening in our cities today reminds me of what happened in 1992 in the aftermath of the acquittal of the officers who beat Rodney King. And for any of you who were there at the time, when that video first came out of watching Rodney King get beaten up, there's just no way, after watching that video, you would have thought that those officers would have been acquitted. And so when that acquittal came down, it wasn't hard to feel really like a godlike wrath at the utter injustice of that verdict. And so when people began protesting and expressing their rage, one could understand. Then very quickly, this wrath became too hard to contain. And so many of the protests soon occurred in Koreatown, and some of the violence and the arson began to take over that 3 mile area in LA, home to Korean Americans, Koreans and Korean Americans. And after several days of violence and arson, much of that community was devastated. Around $500 million of damage sustained, most of which was never recovered. The neighborhood really never recovered with those people who were there, who lost their businesses. And so as that was happening, and I remember my grandmother lived in Koreatown, and my parents were, I remember, afraid for her and some other family we had at the height of the violence. And so in the face of that injustice, sort of innocent business owners losing their livelihoods, one could also understand people taking on the wrath of God. And suddenly now you had, these Korean shop owners walking around carrying guns because they were going to maintain order and justice in their community. And before long, people were shooting each other in the streets. And there was an African American girl who was shot to death because the store owner said she was stealing orange juice. Killing each other over stolen orange juice. And so it is for this reason that Paul, in today's section of his letter to the Romans, tells the Romans, make room, or literally give a place for the wrath of God. In other words, let God have the wrath. Do not listen to the temptation, to the words of the adversary who would tempt you to take on God's wrath yourself. You, and certainly I, cannot handle that. Give room, make room for the wrath of God. Because when you do that, you then create room in yourselves for something else. About 4 years after the riots in LA, I was, I think, a senior in high school, and my high school class went to see a play by Anna Deavere Smith called Twilight, Los Angeles, 1992. And in this play, Anna Deavere Smith played many different characters, and these weren't really characters, these were actual people she had interviewed, and these were the words that they had told her, and she was sort of acting them out. And she played a whole range of characters. I remember sort of almost a comedic turn that she did of Cornel West, someone I didn't really know who was at the time. She played African Americans, she played white people, politicians, police officers, and she also played Korean Americans. And I remember one person she played, an older Korean American woman, came to the end of the play. And this older Korean woman that Anna Deavere Smith was giving voice to was talking about the bitterness that she had felt in her heart about what had happened to her community. But in speaking about this bitterness, this older woman was also able to, in a kind of a grudging way, but in a very genuine way, articulate empathy for the African American community and the centuries of oppression that they have faced here in the United States. And so watching Anna Deavere Smith play this Korean American woman and give voice to her frustrations and anger, but also her own, this older Korean woman's own sort of grudging but real empathy, I realized that that is the way forward. That when we, as Paul says, make room for the wrath of God, what we create in ourselves is this ability to be empathetic, to have compassion for people whose experiences are so different from our own. We can have compassion for African Americans for whom, no matter what they do, I mean, one could be a professor at Harvard, going to your own house and still be considered a threat by police. I cannot imagine the toll and the anger that must take on a person's soul. We can have empathy for many of the shop owners, many of them owned by people of color, a lot of them owned by immigrants, probably don't speak English very well, whose stores and businesses are being attacked in the aftermath of a lot of the protests, very valid protests, against police brutality and injustice. And we can have empathy for the police officers, and not just most of the good ones who are just doing their job, but we can even maybe have empathy for the bad ones, the ones whose hearts have been so gripped by racist hatred. And we can maybe find it in ourselves that when they are thirsty, maybe even them, we can give water to. That when they persecute us, we can bless them. And in this way, we can let ourselves not be overcome by evil, but we can overcome evil with good. Amen.